Today, we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about understanding neurodiversity and communication social abilities in children with intellectual disabilities. So the structure of today's session will be, I'll take the first 50 minutes where I'll talk about my perspective on neurodiversity and in particular, why I think a neurodiversity approach might be really helpful for supporting communication and social abilities in children with intellectual disabilities. So that will be the kind of first 50 minutes. And then we're really lucky to have Jonathan join us today, who will share his experiences of being a father of two girls with Fragile X syndrome, one of which I believe has intellectual disability and autism as well. And to hopefully give some of this quite, because I am a researcher and I do deal with data, some of these points and these data to put it into kind of more of an everyday context. And then we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, we'll wait for that at the end. But if you could write your questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll kind of go through them at the end. So a little bit about who I am. So I'm a lecturer over at UCL at the Clinical Educational and Health Psychology Department. I'm also a research fellow, and I work very closely with Jo Moss, who, if you come to any of the previous webinars before, she did one on diagnostic overshadowing, and she's one of the main leads of the Cerebral Network, so you might have heard of us before. So a lot of our work is about how we can understand and improve the well-being of children with intellectual disabilities, with a particular focus on genetic syndromes. So I kind of just want to make it clear that when I'm discussing neurodiversity, I think it's a really interesting concept that is ever evolving. And I certainly don't have all of the answers or claim to be, the expert in it. And I will be coming from it from coming from my own experiences, one as a researcher, but also as a researcher for those with genetic syndromes, and reflecting on that experience to think about, well, how can this approach be helpful for the broader community? So I suppose a good place to start is, well, what is the neurodiversity approach? And as I said, I think it's a kind of an evolving concept. It's something that's changing and being debated. But what I suppose a key aspect of it is you can kind of think of the neurodiversity approach as an alternative approach to the commonly used medical model. So thinking about how the medical model approaches atypical communication and social styles in people with intellectual disability. Generally, what it suggests is that in order to help someone, to support someone who might show some differences, we might classify kind of the problem, so to speak, and then we need to know how to manage or kind of cure that person. So the way that we would do this is from using developing kind of explanations, understanding the reasons why we see these differences, and then using this to kind of correct that particular behavior or that particular style. So if you're thinking of communication social skills in this way, the goal might be more normalization. So in a good example of this might be, the medical model might be assumed that to support better social interactions for someone with an intellectual disability, we might want to increase their eye contact with other people. And this is based on kind of the fact that neurotypical people, we often use this to support turn-taking, showing social interest, and to maintain social interaction. But the neurodiversity approach can be seen as the kind of alternative way of thinking about these aspects. And whilst it's currently debated, I think there are three really key ideas that are really, I think, are useful for supporting people with an intellectual disability. So this first one is considering that alternative communication, social interaction, and thinking styles, the way we process the world and how that contributes to our social skills and communication. We shouldn't just assume that they're deficits, that their differences are something that need to be corrected to be kind of normalized, but maybe we just see them as differences. So in this way, we aren't excluding, actually perfectly valid communication and social styles. So a good example of this might be someone might not speak, but perhaps they have a range of different gestures that can be used in communication. Or perhaps in the previous example that I gave about eye contact, maybe actually it's not essential for someone to give eye contact to support interaction and to maintain it. And this is particularly critical when we know that a lot of autistic people actually find it really uncomfortable to look at people. So maybe there are other ways that we can support and maintain interaction. And the second point, taking from this medical model, so this idea that to help we have to focus on the challenges means that actually a lot of the focus that we use in social and communication and our understanding of people's skills is really focusing on the challenges, and we're missing actually perhaps their relative strengths. And we need to see it as a full package and recognize these strengths alongside the challenges. And what this does is it provides additional support opportunities to build on perhaps available skills that are already there and can be used to compensate for other aspects that may be a challenge. And then the third aspect is recognizing that actually a person's social environment might support or restrict those with alternative communication and social functioning styles. And I think what this does is it really highlights opportunities to adapt the social environment to provide support in a way that I think is beneficial, because it means we're not necessarily adding additional burden. We're not asking someone the first point of call isn't necessarily to change someone and create burden when they already have quite high levels of complex needs. However, there are a couple of things that I want to be really clear on, in the sense that I'm not arguing. So I'm not arguing, for instance, that if we just change someone's entire environment, that we can remove all of the challenges. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. And I would also never want this approach to ever be an excuse to deny anyone intervention, training, support, skills development. And essentially, I'm not saying that it isn't appropriate to teach skills to people with intellectual disabilities. The way that I see this is more that this is something that we can add to our toolkit, this approach. It can give us a range of options and ideas for support alongside potential appropriate situations where it may be helpful to develop someone's skills. For all of us, I think actually we all need to develop communication and social skills depending on what we're trying to achieve. But essentially, we're going to have more tools in our toolkit, essentially. So why intellectual disability? Why the conversation around neurodiversity in this particular community? So a bit of context, a bit of background. Today's presentation is based on an article that I wrote for the neurodivergent special issue of The Psychologist. So if anyone's interested, you can find it online via the QR code. And actually, it was this article which was the reason that Cerebra reached out to me to talk about this. So it's one of my favorite things that I've written, and it seems to have resonated with people, which is really excellent. But actually, this article was based on a chapter that I'd written with my colleagues, which was actually more focused around why we found it's quite problematic that so much research into communication and social abilities in the broader intellectual community often doesn't actually include particularly in-depth assessment of these abilities, and often includes kind of tools which are not developed for people with intellectual disability, but actually usually more for neurotypical people. And also there's a tendency within this research to sort of lump everyone with an intellectual disability into the same group. Sometimes they might be divided in terms of their level of intellectual disability, so mild, moderate, severe, for instance, but even then, we're not. Basically, what this means is that we're not really capturing in the literature the really highly varied communication and social profiles that we see across individuals with an intellectual disability. And the issue with this is, in my opinion, I think this is leading to a really overly simplified view of people with intellectual disabilities within the literature, which then kind of filters down into our descriptions and our understanding. And this is therefore kind of preventing our understanding of how we can provide individualized support for communication and social functioning. And I found this really interesting because actually, from my background, my research in people with specific genetic syndromes, so these are groups that have basically a very clear biological cause of intellectual disability. But more interestingly, we go into a lot of depth to demonstrate that these groups show really unique and varied types of communication, social and thinking styles. And we really kind of go into depth to show the diversity of the skills and profiles. But I think that also that across these different groups, they're a really good representation of the diversity and skills that we see across the broader intellectual disability community as well. I think there's showing that evidence for what might be relevant to not just people with genetic syndromes, but to the broader community of those with intellectual disability in general. So I wrote this BPS article as actually I realized that these points are really well aligned with the neurodiversity approach, but I also wanted to make sure that the community were really represented in a way around these emerging discussions around neurodiversity. I've sort of noticed a little bit of a tension about, how do we include people with intellectual disability within this framework? And there have been suggestions that actually, severe difficulties with learning and communication represents disorder. But as I said, I think this is a completely oversimplified view of the wide diversity of communication, social and thinking styles that we all see across people with intellectual disability. So whilst this broader literature, as I said, lacks this acknowledgement of diversity, as I said, research in people with genetic syndromes has, in my opinion, and what I've argued, highlighted the benefits on showing the diversity, but also once you understand the particular profiles, highlighted the benefits on capitalizing on someone's strengths and interests, and really kind of getting to grips with the way that we can change the environment to make this supportive. And the first point that I want to demonstrate is the fact that we can have someone with exactly the same level of an intellectual disability or cognitive ability who can show very different communication and social skills and preferences. The good example of this is a paper by Jo Moss. So what Jo did was she asked parents to fill in a questionnaire. We had up to about 800 to 900 parents to fill in questionnaires to get an idea of people's level of sociability. Are they very socially motivated, or do they show kind of indications of actually quite a lot of social shyness? And what she basically demonstrated was that we can place people with different genetic syndromes across this continuum or the spectrum of sociability, ranging from this social shyness up to this high levels of sociability. But the critical point to demonstrate is that where someone is placed on this spectrum of sociability doesn't correspond to their level of intellectual disability at all. So we've got our spectrum of sociability up here that I showed you, and then I've got this kind of range, this demonstration of the range of intellectual disability from severe intellectual disability up to the mild level here. We've got these smaller arrows here to demonstrate the full range that we see across different groups, and I've kind of placed people in where we generally see the most people's level of intellectual disability. So what I want to demonstrate is that for the genetic syndromes, we can see that actually the majority of them are sitting around this kind of moderate level of intellectual disability. And yet we're seeing such, big contrast in where they're placed in terms of this kind of continuum. So we've got Cornelia-de Lange syndrome and Fragile X syndrome sitting at this kind of more on the social shyness end, with Fragile X syndrome kind of being at the more extreme end. And then we have Down syndrome and Rubinstein-Taybi syndrome who are sitting up at this kind of sociability range. And my proposal, as I keep saying, is that the work in these communities is highlighting the benefits of not making assumptions about someone's communication, social and thinking style simply based on their level of intellectual disability, and the opportunities that we can use to identify different styles, be inclusive, and build on strengths and understand the environments that support. Don't just rely on information based on their level of intellectual disability. There's so much more. And a group that really captures this, I think, which I haven't addressed yet, is those with Angelman syndrome. So this group here, which actually are characterized by severe to profound levels of intellectual disability. But then when we look, we can see them completely at the opposite end of the spectrum of sociability when they're actually at this kind of very high levels of social motivation. So a little bit about Angelman syndrome. I'm going to take the opportunity to focus on this group to demonstrate the benefits of understanding this particular type of divergence, this neurodivergence within this group. Taking an example from a group that is characterized actually much more on the kind of severe to profound levels of intellectual disability. So full disclosure, this isn't a group that I directly work with. I've read a lot about them, and also I've worked very closely with colleagues who've worked really closely with these groups. But I think there's some real lessons that we can be learned from some reflections here. So as I said, they're a group that are generally characterized by severe to profound intellectual disability. Actually, in terms of their communication skills, we see that there's generally no speech. So we see real challenges in terms of communication abilities. And yet this really contrasts with relative social strengths, actually. So they're a group that are really, as I mentioned, characterized by really high levels of social motivation and social enjoyment, even relative to groups associated with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities, such as Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome and Fragile X syndrome, which I discussed just now. And what's really interesting and lovely about this group is they show really high levels of laughing and smiling. So often, as I said, I haven't worked with the group, but people have really reported that if you meet someone with Angelman syndrome, you'll come away with really kind of aching cheeks because it's really hard not to laugh and smile back. And I do want to talk, and whilst we do see these strengths, I do want to be sensitive to the fact that it's not the whole story, and this is the importance of really understanding the nuance within these groups. Whilst there are these social strengths, there are some social challenges. So, for example, sometimes people with Angelman syndrome show quite high levels of social initiation, for instance. But they might not always understand when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. And that's going to be challenging for caregivers if you're not going, if it's a point where actually you need to get things done. And there has been some work by Mary Heald, who has worked on trying to identify and teach signals of when someone's available and when there's not. But obviously that is going to be a challenge. And there are challenges with things like maintaining social interaction as well. But clearly, this is a group that is, so much more than just their level of profound and severe intellectual disability, and so much more than their level of speech. And in the context of thinking about our neurodiversity approach, actually what we're finding is that this understanding someone's social preference can be really helpful in intervention. So what Mary Heald actually found was that if you increase someone's social contact, and actually improve and increase learning of other areas or skills that might be a challenge for people with Angelman syndrome. So for example, other communication abilities or perhaps kind of day-to-day functioning abilities. But there's so much more. So this is a really helpful idea of how the neurodiversity approach can be supportive. And actually, when we look into even more detail about this, there's even more lessons to be learned, I think. So we might, for example, assume that because children with Angelman syndrome are broadly characterized as being sociable, they're generally socially motivated, that perhaps any form of social contact might be helpful within any kind of intervention that might support learning. And actually what Mary did was she looked at whether there were specific combinations of social behavior that children with Angelman syndrome find most rewarding. So is it that kind of all social behaviors are rewarding, or is it only specifically when, we give eye contact whilst talking, or perhaps it's when we give physical contact, but not when we're looking at them, for instance? What's going to be the most helpful to support learning and development? And what she's found actually was that most children were motivated by only one specific combination. And more interestingly, even though this is a group that, shows a lot of similarities with each other, the combination that increased and supported learning the most was different to each individual child. So just to demonstrate this, and I'm going to talk you through this graph and what it shows. So we've got an individual graph for each individual child. And we have a sort of number of sessions where we're kind of looking for the learning rate and seeing whether it improves or not. And what you need to know here is that basically the higher number means that kind of the more higher number of that particular behavior that is trying to be taught is being seen within that session. So these lines are kind of showing, the rate of learning and the improvement over time. And what we're demonstrating here is that if you don't need to know the particular combinations, but once the combinations which are represented by the different shapes in the graph, so we've got like a square here, we've got a circle down here, are all different between each individual child. So what to me this indicates is that we need to understand exactly what type of social contact might be motivating, and essentially that we shouldn't be making assumptions. And it's really highlighting to me the importance of individual assessment and understanding that child's unique needs, preferences, styles, even if perhaps someone has a genetic syndrome. So within this particular context, there's lots of benefits for knowing the what to expect for people with genetic syndromes, but that's not where the sort of the investigation or the story should stop. We need to be looking and digging much deeper into understanding what is really helpful for that individual. But I love this work because it's demonstrating that once we understand someone's unique preferences and we can use that, we can support a group that has actually previously been characterized as actually having quite a slow learning rate. So it's really important to demonstrate that learning is possible and just demonstrating the right way of doing this depending on that child's individual needs. And a good example of a particular needs that might be really beneficial for this type of learning is obviously communication. But actually, there's a little bit more to that, I think, in terms of just characterizing people with Angelman syndrome as just struggling with communication, and actually using appropriate measures and methods to identify all of the skills that are available that might not be captured by standardized assessments. So often when we're characterizing kind of profiles of communication skills, and particularly in research, we might use something called standardized assessments. So the professionals out there, you might be quite familiar with a few of these that I put up here. And these are helpful, often when we apply these standardized assessments, we often see a very stark contrast between speaking and listening skills. So generally better listening skills in people with Angelman syndrome compared to their speaking skills. And this is helpful to know. This is helpful for providing us with a very kind of broad ballpark description of development. But the issue with this is that these sorts of assessments often overlook many available communication abilities, generally because they're based on these kind of neurotypical ideals of development, and therefore they're often prioritizing speech. And this is a different story from what we get from unstandardized parent reports. So when we go to parents and we ask them about what sorts of communication skills and methods is your child using, actually for Angelman syndrome, we find that parents describe them as really kind of multimodal communicators. They're often using a really rich combination of nonverbal strategies. So the most common forms often include gestures, but also a lot of individuals have been found to use kind of communication tools, devices, also signing as well, up to 50%. And this has been really helpful because actually previously a lot of people thought that they wouldn't be able to use those kind of more sophisticated techniques. And in particular, people with Angelman syndrome are particularly proficient in something called dialectic gestures. So these are the gestures that we use to direct attention to objects, people, events, environments. And what I find really interesting about, all of these possible non-verbal communication skills that are available is that parents actually often report that it's these gestures that are the most meaningful and effective forms of communication, even if children have alternative kind of AAC devices available. Actually, parents are kind of saying, actually, these are the ones that are working the best for us, which is really interesting. And one important strategy involves for which we can further develop on the skills that are readily available. So even if verbal ability is not there, we've got a range of motor actions that people with Angelman syndrome seem to be really comfortable with. And this has highlighted other strategies such as developing enhanced natural gestures to develop these motor skills and shape them into more clear communicative behaviors. They're really focusing on what people have available to them rather than what's not available. They're thinking the gestures and the motor skills that are available rather than just thinking about the speech skills and developing those skills, which are more challenging. So a good example of this might be, looking at behaviors that are already there. So for example, if a child is pushing away food to indicate that they're finished, but in other situations, they might be using more inappropriate behaviors such as kind of, throwing objects and things like that, then we can build on what's already there and help them to use this similar signal in other contexts as well. So as I said, this isn't supposed to be a presentation about Angelman syndrome for FAIR. We need to reflect on what can this teach us about using a neurodiversity approach towards the broader community of people with an intellectual disability. So hopefully I've made this clear here about the fact that don't make assumptions about someone's communication or social style solely based on their level of intellectual disability. The importance of focusing on strengths and interests, not just challenges. So really kind of utilizing that social motivation and that social interest to develop other skills and other areas of challenge. Really trying to embrace and build on alternative styles of communication and social interaction that's already available. So thinking about the communication skills that are readily available and building on those. And the importance of understanding an individual's unique needs, strengths, and preferences. And in order to do that, using appropriate, detailed, and in-depth assessment methods. So this is both in the example of thinking about the particular behaviors that are particularly helpful for developing and learning and skills, but also thinking about the communication behaviors as well, going beyond the standardized reports and trying to also use methods that are more appropriate for intellectual disability or are able to capture the range of skills that tend to be more used for people who have a severe to profound level of intellectual disability. And on this note, the real importance of being able to collaborate with parents who have already really valuable insights into their child's unique abilities, and making sure that we're really utilizing the information that they already have. So that's taking an example from a group that is really kind of at the lower end of the severe to profound levels of intellectual disability. And I want to move on to a different group, which is more characterized at the sort of higher end of intellectual disability. So we have people often at the moderate level of Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome is generally characterized by moderate levels of intellectual disability, and yet they are kind of more characterized by social shyness. And this is also included in those who tend to be on the more mild end as well. And the example that I want to use from this group is the idea of really trying to drill down and understand the reasons for why the social shyness occurs. And in particular, starting with understanding how looking at the specific context of when the social shyness emerges can give us loads of information about why it occurs, and then inform us, give us this information on how to support them as a result. So generally, when we talk about people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, you'll see lots of descriptions about their social challenges in the literature. So things like autism-like features, difficulties with new places, new people, social anxiety, shyness, social withdrawal, selective mutism, and also these changes with age as well. They tend to peak sort of at later adolescence and early adulthood as well. However, this, in my opinion, is really only kind of part of the picture. And again, it's this idea of an oversimplified characterization, and we really need to look in detail. So first, thinking about the context that we see the challenges come in and what this can teach us essentially. So to take this example, I'm going to introduce a study by Haley Crawford, who looked at the specific social situations in which social anxiety and social motivation emerged in people with genetic syndromes. So including people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, and then comparing them to Fragile X syndrome and Rubinstein-Tavy syndrome. To basically help us understand when the profile of when social anxiety emerges, if it happens in a particular context for a particular group, is it specific to that group, or actually do we see it in the other groups as well? So is it more reflective of having an intellectual disability or a genetic syndrome in general? So how much does this information, how much does this occur within that specific group, and how much is that going to guide how much stratification of the support are we going to need for that particular group essentially? So in this particular study, participants with CDLS and the other groups interacted with an adult in different contexts. We had a non-social control condition, so they were just kind of sitting together, they were close by, but that each of them were doing kind of different activities to one another. And we have this kind of non-social conditions to make sure that, you know, any anxiety that we see in the other conditions and the social conditions, if it's lower here, then we know that any anxiety that we see is specific to social anxiety rather than kind of anxiety more broadly. But what I really like about this study is rather than just looking at kind of a non-social and a social situation, Haley really looked at the different contexts to see whether anxiety emerges within specific contexts. What's the reason for it, essentially? So in this particular context, she had what she called a voluntary social interaction. So this is when an examiner was showing some like holiday pictures to the participant. And it was really up to the participant whether they said anything. They could just look at the photos together and just kind of watch them and listen to the examiner. And they could say something or contribute something if they wanted to, but there was absolutely no expectation to do so. And then we had the required social interaction. So this is more like a conversation. But the researcher helped the conversation to get going by kind of asking open and closed questions that the participant could respond to. And then we had the performance situation. This is a very, very kind of classic situation where we might see social anxiety, where the participant had to stand up and they had to tell a story based on some picture cards that were being held up to them. And participants did this with a familiar person and also an unfamiliar person as well. So this is kind of giving us an idea of, is anxiety also occurring more and dependent on who they're interacting with as well. So giving us a lots of rich environments and context to really unpick when anxiety is emerging. And again, sorry, this is another complex graph, and I'm going to step you through again. So for each graph is a representation of each of our different groups. So we've got the CDLS group over here. And what we see in people with CDLS is that social anxiety overall, the levels of social anxiety didn't actually differ that much from the other groups. But what was specific to those with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome is that they showed social anxiety within a very specific social context, which was the voluntary interaction context. So this was the context where you just the adult was just showing them pictures, and actually the participant didn't necessarily have to do much there. They could speak if they wanted to. They just had to look at the pictures. There really wasn't that much to do. And actually, I found this really interesting because this isn't necessarily the situation that I would assume would be the context where we would find anxiety emerge. So I love this in terms of really going into the context because it reminds me not to make assumptions about what someone might find anxiety provoking and what they might not. But then there's that kind of question of, okay, so social anxiety is emerging specifically in this context and also specifically with an unfamiliar adult as well. And so what is it about this context that might be causing anxiety then? What is it that this situation requires? And I think the thing for us with thinking about Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome is there's good reasoning to think that it's something about when spoken language is optional, when it's unprompted, essentially. And this idea that actually maybe this is a situation that doesn't have a lot of structure compared to the other conditions. In a conversation, if you're being asked questions and then you're just required to answer, there's a very kind of clear to and fro structure within that situation. And likewise, in the performance situation, there's a clear structure in terms of the story that you're having to tell back. But actually, perhaps the social rules within the voluntary social interaction was a little less clear. And this idea that if they were required to speak, if they had to speak, then is something that they would have to think about for themselves. They'd have to think about and generate the speech themselves. They'd have to think about what to say because it wasn't necessarily completely obvious what might be appropriate within that context. And I'm going to step you through some of the reasons why we think this fits well, this narrative fits well with explaining these results. So part of it is that there is good reason to think that there's something about speaking and generating verbal responses that might be particularly anxiety provoking for people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome. So it's good to reiterate that these are people who are often verbal. They might have a mild level of intellectual disability. So actually cognitively, they can speak, and that's not too much of a problem. They have that ability, but there seems to be something that makes it challenging within a social context. So a good example of this is a study from Caroline Richards, where she recorded anxiety-related behaviours at the point in which children with CDLS had to speak. So there are two really kind of clear, often really clear markers of anxiety in kind of neurotypical children. One is avoidance of eye contact. So if you're feeling quite anxious, often many of us will kind of look away or not look at the person that we're speaking to. And the other one is fidgeting. I'm definitely a fidget when I'm very anxious as well. But there's a couple of points which I find really interesting. So actually, people with CDLS, even when they were anxious, actually showed really good eye contact, which I found really interesting. And actually, for me, this is a good reflection on this idea of not making assumptions, but really understanding what anxiety looks like for that particular individual and that particular group. It might not look the same as perhaps, neurotypical children, for instance. But what we did see was that there was lots of fidgeting kind of rising up to the point in which that person had to speak. This seems to be their particular kind of anxiety marker. So again, kind of comparing across different genetic syndromes. So I'm comparing those with CDLS against Cru-de-Chasles syndrome. So these two groups, again, generally show quite similar levels of social anxiety, but it's really digging into the context to determine when that anxiety is emerging. So this is a complicated looking graph. And what you need to know here is that this line in the middle, this is representing the point at which the person with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome was speaking. And this is the rate of fidgeting, so it's anxiety-related behavior. And you can see that it's rising up. It's really rising up really quickly and plateauing up to the point in which they had to speak. And then once they've spoken, you can see it's coming right back down. And this is a pattern that we don't see in those with Cru-de-Chasles syndrome at all. So it really is kind of emphasizing this idea about specific challenges only in that group, in those with CDLS, in situations where they must speak. And this highlights the importance of perhaps looking at potential reasons for this, which might be expressive language challenges. And actually, this makes sense. So we generally find that people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome show stronger listening abilities compared to the speaking abilities, and which is interesting because it's a similar kind of profile to those with Angelman syndrome, which just goes to show the importance of really doing an in-depth assessment of communication abilities, regardless of someone's level of intellectual disability. But what's more interesting is research to show that perhaps there are compensatory strategies being used by people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome without being prompted at all, in lieu of this expressive language, these kind of speaking abilities. So this is a paper by Effie Pearson, who recorded the words used and the gestures used between different groups within a conversational interaction. And unsurprisingly, we see that people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome and also people with Down syndrome spoke significantly fewer words than typically developing children. But what's more interesting to me is this really high kind of rate of gesture use being used by those with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome. Not just relative to people with Down syndrome, but also actually to typically developing children too. They seem to have this kind of advantage of using gestures relative to even typically developing children. And this is this idea of communicative strength and these compensatory strategies that perhaps we can build on and develop or try to understand and acknowledge as valid communication methods. And I think this is really interesting in the context of the high levels of selective mutism that we see in this group as well. So up to about 40% of people with CDS are reported to show selective mutism. And this is something that is often considered to be linked with anxiety, kind of an anxiety condition. But with these compensatory strategies, we're kind of seeing that perhaps there is this desire to communicate, that they're finding ways around it quite naturally, actually. And perhaps there is this motivation. And this is something that's supported actually by a Haley Crawford study that we looked at earlier. So even though there's high levels of anxiety, she also found that there was really high levels of social motivation in this group as well. To similar levels of people with Down syndrome, who are commonly considered to be kind of a hypersocial group as well. So looking and understanding with the context that these emerge in and linking together the communication and the social profiles has been really helpful to identify the strengths. And we've seen this with both Angelman syndrome and CDLS. But to me, I kind of have always had a bit of a question as to why are these difficulties emerging? And one of the ways that we can kind of understand why people are struggling is by looking at their thinking styles. So this is a lot of the work that I've done previously. And I think this is important because we understand how people think, how they process the world around them. I think it helps us to understand and put ourselves in their shoes so much more and why they might be having difficulty. Also, from a neurodiversity approach, actually, neurodiversity isn't just about recognizing, the communication and social behaviors that we directly see, but it's also understanding how people and embracing also how people process the world differently to help us understand and support them as well. So when we started this work, we started off looking at something called mentalizing. So these are, you can kind of think about them as mind reading abilities. So we use these abilities every day to understand other people's mental states. So this might be what someone's intending to do, what they want, what they believe, what they're feeling. And we all use this information within social situations to predict what someone is going to do. And this helps us to know if we know what someone's going to do in a social situation, then we can start preparing and we know how to respond in turn to them. We started here because we kind of made intuitive sense. There's a lot of literature that shows that other groups that have social challenges also have difficulties in these particular skills. But also from an anxiety point of view, thinking about CDLS and the context that they find challenging. If you don't know what someone's thinking, what they're believing, and you can't predict what someone's going to do, that's going to make social situations quite anxiety provoking, particularly with an unfamiliar person who you might not be as familiar with and be able to predict as much, and particularly in situations where there isn't that kind of structure. So when you don't really know whether you're expected to speak or not, there isn't a kind of structured question and answer response, for instance. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing has been on finding the right assessment for individuals, because typically when these abilities are assessed, they're usually used by using kind of stories, using dolls to set out a story or a situation with different characters, and then asking people to verbally report on what that particular character is thinking, what they're feeling. And this is really challenging for people with intellectual disability in general, mainly because there's quite a lot to remember, and also the difficulties of perhaps giving a verbal response. So the work that we've been doing, there's a preprint that's available if anyone is interested, is trying to make more inclusive methods to really get into how people process the world. I make this point because actually a lot of work is shied away from this perhaps in people with intellectual disability, of not really knowing how to approach it. But I think it's really important to show that there are ways that we can assess this. So we used an eye tracking paradigm to see whether or not people could track someone's mental state. So we had this pig who popped a ball into a box. This was shown by our agent here. She turns away, so she doesn't know that this naughty pig is now taking the ball away. So essentially what we're saying is she's got a false belief. So when there's a flash, we're looking at, you can see here that this person is tracking where that person is going to look for that object. So they're acknowledging that that person doesn't know where the object is, and that's where they're going to look. And the data was really interesting actually in people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, and really iterates the point of not making assumptions in this group, because actually, so what you need to know is that the higher the number basically means the better mentalizing. And actually we can see in those with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome that the majority of them are doing really well on this task. And even though they show social anxiety and social challenges, actually they understand, they seem to be understanding that agent, that actor's point of view and their mental state. So we know that the challenges aren't from these very kind of traditionally thought mentalizing abilities, but actually there's something really unique in someone's processing style, and specifically in people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, that we have found is probably contributing to this anxiety. So this is particularly linked to something called executive function. So Executive functions are something that you can think of as your brain management system. These are the skills that we use to help control and plan our behavior. It's really helpful for things like day-to-day planning, solving problems, and adapting to new situations. And what we found is that there's a unique connection that we see in people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome between two types of executive function and how much they speak. And this is a link that we see just in this group and not in other groups, such as those with Down syndrome. So one is working memory. So if you struggle with working memory, they were less likely to speak. And actually, I think that kind of makes sense in a lot of ways, because in a conversation, there's a lot to remember, there's a lot to keep up with. And then the second one is planning. So planning your actions to achieve a goal. And if you're thinking about the situations where you have to generate or think about what to say without there being an obvious prompt, kind of makes sense to me that this might be particularly difficult situation if you struggle with these planning skills um, uh, in these sort of social situations as well. So this is really quite a journey, I suppose, into really getting into the depths of why people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, but also really, I suppose, for me, encouraging us to think about the in-depth reasons of why people are showing difficulties within the particular contexts. So thinking about not just the compensatory strategies, but really putting ourselves into someone's shoes. And then my argument is that this is going to help us as communicative partners and social partners to adjust and make environments which are going to be supportive for someone's thinking style, as well as their kind of communication style as well. So in the context of people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, who are perhaps have quite, relatively good listening skills and understanding, but might just be struggling with selective mutism or being able to express themselves, alternative communication tools such as talking mats might be really helpful. So talking mats in this example is a visual communication tool that's designed to help people with communication difficulties express what matters to them. So this is something that I've used in the context of trying to find out what's important to people at school. What's going well, what's not going so well, what's important for your teacher to know about you at school, your likes, your dislikes, and providing a kind of visual structure to support those kind of conversations. And I think that this is really, really helpful for people like those with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, where we know that actually maybe there is the motivation to communicate, but we can support them to communicate and interact by taking away some of those memory difficulties, because we're taking that away by giving this kind of visual cue, so they don't have to keep it in mind. And we are also giving them the opportunity to respond in a way where they don't have to speak. So essentially what they will do is we'll give them a card one by one, and they can indicate where their preferences are dependent on this kind of top line here. So if they don't want to speak, then they don't have to. But generally what we kind of find when we use these tools is that because we're taking away some of those executive function demands, actually people often give much more information verbally, because they're not having to keep so much in mind, and they're not as anxious as well. So yes, giving opportunities and really thinking about what's their processing style, what's getting in the way, and creating environments that are inclusive and really supporting people to engage when they want to. So in terms of the lessons, I'm going to go through these quite quickly, because I have talked for quite a while, which is, I have so much to say. But a lot of these instances are actually very similar to what we talked about in Angelman syndrome. It's just looking at them in a different context, within a very specific, the different syndrome who are characterized by a different level of intellectual disability, of which actually the strengths are different, and the reasons behind why these difficulties emerge are different. And there's also some additional lessons which I think are helpful here. So one is to think about the link between someone's communication and social style. If someone is showing anxiety primarily because of a communication issue that's getting in the way, then we can work towards removing that barrier. The argument to take the time to understand each person's unique thinking style. This is tricky because there isn't a lot of assessments out there, but this is something that we're trying to develop much more in research. The importance of identifying the social environments where the social challenges occur, and all of the rich information that has given us for people with CDLS. And then this real idea of using this information to better create supportive environments by being better communication partners. And I don't have much time left, but I just wanted to really briefly introduce and talk about one last group, which is Fragile X syndrome. So this group who are on the completely opposite end of the social shyness scale from where we started with Angelman syndrome. To essentially talk about the importance of making sure that we are talking about people in a very holistic way and the consequences of the potential consequences that might occur if we don't do this. So this is really just to direct you to an article that we've written about the importance of focusing not just on the challenges, but also on the relative strengths in people with Fragile X syndrome in the context of delivering a diagnosis. So the challenges that people with Fragile X syndrome experience are very real. There is lots of gaze aversion, social anxiety, but what's often missed within medical descriptions, which is then passed down to families, is also a lot of the relative strengths that can be built upon as well. And this is a group where it's really clear from when we're kind of looking at where they're placed in that very broad sociability scale, it's really only part of the picture. So whilst there are a lot of challenges, there's a lot of strengths that people with Fragile X syndrome show. There is social attention, and even if there's social anxiety, there's also social motivation. There always seems to be this kind of push and pull where they kind of want to interact, but there's always just something getting in the way. And the behavior which I think shows this the most is the Fragile X handshake. So it's this really interesting behavior that we see in people with Fragile X syndrome where they'll reach out to shake someone's hand whilst also avoiding their eye contact. But as I said, the issue is that a lot of medical descriptions or descriptions in literature are focusing on really painting quite a negative picture. And often this is very different from what we talk about as parents or experts or researchers, which seems to be missing. And we essentially need to correct that. And I think this is where a neurodiversity approach can be really helpful from a research point of view. And I don't have time to go through this, but that's fine. I just kind of wanted to make the point that actually without looking, we've seen that there's a whole range of relative strengths in people with Fragile X syndrome that we need to bring out much more in the medical literature. So I've already overrun, and essentially today I hope I've really put across to you the evidence of the importance of including people within the neurodiversity movement and the potential benefits of this approach where we can kind of add our toolkit on how to support the intellectual disability. And essentially, to me, this involves acknowledging this label of intellectual disability is part of the picture, but it's a much smaller part than perhaps might be expected by some. And I want to reiterate that this is really kind of one approach of looking at it that I'm reflecting on as my experience as a researcher and as a person without an intellectual disability. But I hope this provides an opportunity to start these conversations much more explicitly. And also start to include the voices of people with an intellectual disability as well. So I'm going to pause there. Apologies for overrunning, Jonathan. And I will now pass over to you to discuss your experiences and your thoughts on the neurodiversity approach with your experiences of being a parent.
Great, thank you very much, Katherine. I haven't got a PowerPoint. This is a much less academic presentation and very much my own experiences as a parent. We have two girls with Fragile X syndrome who are now in their early 20s. But I hope these stories and what I'll talk about will echo and a lot of what Katherine's been talking about. So I guess like many parents, when we first found that my partner was pregnant, were wondering what our children would be like. And both I and my partner had considerable academic success. And I think we just assumed that the children would likewise be successful in those sort of traditional academic spheres. We didn't know whether it be science or literature or whatever it would be, but we just, I think, took that for granted. But it was evident fairly early on that our first child, called Laurel, and I should say they're both happy for me to talk about them, were different from other children, and certainly within a few years we were seeking advice from medical professionals. The first first lengthy set of assessments were utterly inconclusive. The consultant said to us, our daughter was different, but there was no diagnosis that could be made. It was a mystery, and we just have to accept that they were different without a label. I remember a week or so after that, suddenly the consultant phoning us from halfway up a mountain, saying he'd suddenly remembered a condition he hadn't thought of before and wanted to test for it. Indeed, that led to us finding out the Fragile X diagnosis. But as Katherine said, that was very much presented to us in terms of negative things. We were told a whole set of potential difficulties that the children would face. It was presented solely in terms of bad news, things that they couldn't do. And I think, as Katherine said, that's only part of the picture. There certainly are challenges, but I hope, as I'll explain, there are also great positive things too. One of the difficulties with Fragile X syndrome in particular is that it doesn't have a set of definite characteristics. So you can't say, well, all Fragile X people are like this, or this is a typical Fragile X syndrome. There's a person. There's a list of over 100 different ways in which Fragile X can manifest itself. And each person will get a sort of a selection of those, but they're not, it's not therefore easy as a parent to say, well, this is what my child will be like. I guess the first time it really came home to me was the tea towels that children bring home from school. I don't know if you've ever seen these tea towels where children in the class are invited to draw a picture of themselves and then to write their name underneath. When our eldest daughter Laurel brought hers home, there were lots of beautifully, carefully drawn pictures of faces and then beautifully written names underneath. And then in the bottom left-hand corner was a great squiggle, and you couldn't really make it out, but that was her name, and that really was obvious then that where her level of drawing and writing was very different from other people in the class. And I think at the time I felt rather embarrassed that other parents would see that, and it would obviously it'd be obvious that she was different. But certainly now that tea towel is one of my most treasured possessions. The picture now looks like a great expression of joy, and it's so much more fluid and crazy and imaginative than other people's. Certainly, there were lots of challenges at school, but often it was a misunderstanding as much as anything else. I remember when Laurel was given her first multiple choice test, and she had to, of course, tick the box which had the correct answer. The teacher called me in saying that she wasn't trying, it was a terrible piece of work, and the teacher showed me the form and it was just covered in marks and squiggles. I apologized and said I'd have a word with her to try harder. But when I got the sheet home, I looked more carefully at it. And I could see that actually what she'd done is tick every single box on the form. Not only the boxes with the answers, but also the typeface was quite rectangular. So the G, she had ticked the little box in the G. And in fact, she'd quite brilliantly, in a way, gone through and found everything that could be seen as a box and ticked it, which wasn't what was wanted, but was actually a genuine effort on her part to see all that she had done. I'll never forget too her performance in the 100-meter race on Sports Day. As the different pupils sort of set off at great speed, Laurel set off at a very steady, genteel pace, much more like on the catwalk than on the athletics field. And although she was last by the long way, I think her elegance in her performance produced the loudest cheer. Certainly, they both really struggled with GCSEs. I think Joe managed to get one or possibly two. Laurel failed nearly all of them. But it was interesting that they both after that have found more success. So Joanna went on to do a BTEC course. And one of the things that really worked for her was the questions that she was asked, it was a health and social care course, were more in terms of case studies. So rather than asking abstract questions, she was asked to advise a particular person. So Bert is a bus driver, age 55, and he has diabetes. How should he change his lifestyle or something like that? And Joe's rather different from Laurel. She loves talking to people. She loves getting out and about. And she loved that model of question where she felt she could actually talk to someone. She could imagine a person she was talking to. And in fact, she went on to do really well in her BTEC course with that case study approach. Whereas if you'd asked her abstractly, how should someone with diabetes live? She wouldn't know the answer. So although both Joe and Laurel have Fragile X, they've got very, very different personalities. And perhaps that's most brought home by their journeys on the bus. They both like traveling by bus. Joe, when she gets on the bus, will immediately look for who looks lonely or is anyone looking sad, and she'll go and sit next to them and she'll have a good chat. Laurel will like the second row at the top on the left-hand side, or if not that, must be a seat on her own. Joe being so friendly and loving to chat, it's obviously a slight worry for parents. Are you worried about the situations that might arise? And it's produced times of anxiety, but in the end, I think we thought it was best for her to be able to talk to who she wanted to, and that's produced some wonderful moments. She went on a bus a few years ago, and there was an older woman who she thought was looking lonely, so chatted to her and found out that she was going to the doctors and was rather nervous about the appointment. And Joe said, "Oh, I'll go with you," and waited for her during the appointment. And then after the appointment said, "I'm going to take you to Marks and Spencer's for tea." And they went off to Marks and Spencer's for tea. And Joe was so proud that she'd been able to help someone. And I assumed the older woman was thrilled to have someone looking after her. And I remember on a Sunday morning, Joe taking the bus and noticing a vicar on the bus. And so sat next to the vicar and asked him if he was going to give a sermon. And the vicar said yes. And Joe said, "I think sermons are too long and very boring." And then she said, "Actually," she said to the vicar, "if I was you, all you need to tell people is to love each other. That's all you need to say." And then she said to me, "Daddy, it was very funny because there were big tears on his cheeks, but he had a big smile on his face as well." And I think that's a sign that Joe perhaps found a truth there. Where they've now ended up, I think, is a really good sign of how their strengths. So Joe now works in a care home and absolutely loves looking after the elderly residents, particularly those with dementia. She's much happier with a more simple conversation, talking about things you can see, and she loves listening to their stories, and she's really found a role in which her caring nature can come through. On her first day at the job, she was asked to give some older residents a bath, and she was told they don't like their baths, so you just have to do it as quickly as possible. And when she came home, she said, "I'm not surprised they don't like their bath. There's no bubble bath and no yellow ducks." So she's immediately went out to buy some yellow ducks and some bubble bath, and now they love having their baths. And so I think there's a sign that her from her perspective, having yellow ducks and bubble bath is really important. And she was able to use that, which perhaps other people hadn't sort of thought of as a way that's really effective for her to provide care. Laurel, as I said, failed all her GCSEs, but absolutely wanted to go to university. We said that wasn't going to be possible, but she took GCSE maths, I think it's 6 times, and finally managed to pass that, and is doing a course on textile design. She's very, very good with colors and very good with shapes, and the course is just the perfect one for her. And although she has to record the lectures and listen to them 3 or 4 times to try and get the main points, and she may not be getting the top marks, but she's managing to get through. And one of the things that she loves doing in life is eating. She's somehow very skinny, even though she eats so much. But fortunately, she's become very good friends with the chef at the university canteen. And he's recognized that she likes things done properly. So now she has her own table with a tablecloth, proper cutlery, and she always chooses the special of the day, which the chef very much approves of. I think the chef loves it that there's a student who really appreciates good food, and she loves having her special table there. So I think although they certainly have found challenges, I think we've tried to focus very much on the special skills that they've got. Laurel's very much caring ability, and she's found a job where she can use those skills and is hugely loved by the residents as she loves them. And Laura, with her particular talent to be able to spot details in color and being able to work on computers, and has found a course that she can develop those. So I think just to finish, some thoughts on what it means to be a parent, and I guess in today's society we often think of parenthood as a competition, that you're trying to produce the best. Your child does better than everybody else's, and that's of course such a harmful thing to way of being a parent. And what's particularly wrong about that is you're trying to make your child be something you want them to be, rather than letting the child be the person they want to be. But more importantly, I think we often see parenthood as about something parents do to children, rather than recognizing that children also do much for parents. And I know my children have done so much to care for me. We assume parents care for their children, but we must never forget how much children care for their parents. And although the job of a parent is to teach the children teach us so much as well. And certainly I've learned so much from my children about finding joy in unexpected places, always being looking out to find new and exciting things, or meet new people, find things just ridiculously funny that we often forget to do as adults. So I think one of the joys of raising a child with a disability is that perhaps it helps you to break free from that model of parenthood that's competitive and controlling, and to try and rethink what is important about life, and to learn so much from children. Thank you. That's all I had to say, Katherine. So back over to you to look over the Q&A, I think.
Thank you so much. It's a lovely reflection, and it's just so lovely to hear of all of their so many things to congratulate them on as well. What an excellent journey. And also it was really lovely because I think you did such an excellent job of talking about all of the things that aren't captured in that I had to go through very, very quickly at the end about Fragile X syndrome, and the things that we don't talk about, such as the kindness, the helping, that we do actually start to see help in the data, which is really, really lovely.